well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. And how long has it been since we've heard that type of statement from the Supreme Court? But was John Jay competent to offer such a statement? Yes. He was the original Chief Justice and one of the three men most responsible for our having the Constitution today. And he said that we should elect Christians for our rulers. George Washington's farewell address is yet another aspect of our heritage which has disappeared from student texts. His farewell address once appeared as a separate school textbook for over a century. Students were taught that Washington's farewell address was the most significant political speech ever delivered to the nation. And why not? He's the father of the country. He spent 45 years of his life in public service, everything from commander-in-chief through 2 terms as president. He's the man who was president of the convention that gave us the Constitution. He was the president of the United States who called for the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. And he was the man who oversaw its formation. Certainly, he knew the intent of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In his farewell address, he reminded America what had brought us to success and warned us what must be done to continue it. Yet, amazingly, his farewell address has not been seen in most textbooks for nearly 4 decades. Why? Doesn't Washington have anything to offer the nation today? No. Apparently, the problem with his farewell address today is its religious emphasis. For 4 of his dozen or so warnings to the nation were overtly religious. It is interesting to note that in the last 5 years, his farewell address has begun to reappear in college textbooks, minus those 4 religious warnings. In his farewell address, Washington pointed out that the 2 foundations for political prosperity in America were religion and morality, and that no one could be called an American patriot who ever attempted to separate politics from its 2 foundations. Washington explained, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. Washington believed that if an individual attempted to separate religion and morality from politics, that he could not be called an American patriot. These type of statements we do not hear much anymore, but such were the statements of America's founders, the statements of America's history. Our founding fathers delivered to us a system of government which has enjoyed unprecedented success. We are now the world's longest ongoing constitutional republic, 200 years under the same document and under one form of government. That's an accomplishment unknown among contemporary nations. For example, Russia, Italy, France, and other nations underwent revolutions at about the same time as the American Revolution, but with very different results. Consider France. In the last 200 years, it has gone through 7 completely different forms of government. Italy is now in its 51st, yet we're still in our first. Where then did our founders acquire the ideas that produced such longevity? Other nations certainly had access to what our founders utilized, yet evidently chose not to. From what sources did our founders choose their ideas? This question was asked by political science professors at the University of Houston. They felt, and rightfully so, that they could determine the source of the founders' ideas if they could collect writings from the founding era and see whom the founders were quoting. The researchers assembled 15,000 writings from the founding era, no small sample, and searched those writings. That project spanned 10 years, but at the end of that time, the researchers had isolated 3,154 direct quotes made by the founders and had identified the source of those quotes. The researchers discovered that Baron Charles Montesquieu was the man quoted most often by the Founding Fathers, with 8.3% of the founders' quotes being taken from his writings. Sir William Blackstone was the second most quoted individual, with 7.9% of the founders' quotes, and John Locke was third with 2.9%. Surprisingly, the researchers discovered that the founders quoted directly out of the Bible 4 times more often than they quoted Montesquieu, 4 times more often than they quoted Blackstone, and 12 times more often than they quoted John Locke. 34% of the founders' quotes came directly out of the Bible. The study was even more impressive when the source of the ideas used by Montesquieu and Blackstone and Locke were identified. Consider, for example, the source of Blackstone's ideas. Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws was first introduced in 1768, and for the next 100 years, America's courts quoted Blackstone to settle disputes, to define words, and to examine procedure. Blackstone's Commentaries was the final word in the Supreme Court. So what was the significant source of Blackstone's ideas? Perhaps the best answer to that question can be given through the life of Charles Finney. Charles Finney is known as a famous revivalist, minister, and preacher from one of America's greatest revivals, the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. Finney, in his autobiography, spoke of how he received his call to the ministry. He explained that having determined to become a lawyer, he, like all other law students at the time, commenced the study of Blackstone's Commentaries on Law. Finney noted that Blackstone's commentaries not only provided the laws, it also provided the biblical concepts on which those laws were based. Finney explained that in the process of studying Blackstone's commentaries, he read so much of the Bible that he became a Christian and received his call to the ministry. Finney's personal life story clearly identifies a major source of Blackstone's ideas for law. So while 34% of the founders' quotes came directly out of the Bible, many of their quotes were taken from men, like Blackstone, who had used the Bible to arrive at their own conclusions. Numerous components of our current government can be shown through these early writings to have their source in biblical concepts. For example, the concept for the three branches of government can be found in Isaiah 33:22. The logic for the separation of powers was based on Jeremiah 17:9. The basis of tax exemptions for churches was found in Ezra 7:24, and many other examples. This biblical heritage was so well understood during the early years of the nation, and the writings of the numerous founding fathers were so well known, that in later years the Supreme Court ruled in the founders' intention, keeping biblical principles as the basis. For example, notice this ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1892. The court said, "No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation." What would lead the court to conclude that we are a Christian nation? This case was not long, only 16 pages in the court records, but the court provided 87 different historical precedents to support its conclusions. The court quoted the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Congresses, the acts of the state governments, and so on. At the end of 87 precedents, the court explained that it could continue to cite many additional precedents, but that certainly 87 were sufficient to conclude that we were a Christian nation. Keep in mind that the court provided 87 precedents in this case. This is important because the courts based their decision on precedents. To the court, it is important to go back and examine both history and rulings from previous cases so that the court can continue to be consistent in its present rulings. We'll return to the importance of precedents a little later. In 1844, a school in Philadelphia announced that it would teach its students morality, but not religion. It believed that it didn't need Christianity in the Bible, that it could teach morality without them. Sounds just like schools today. This policy, among others, caused this case to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. Some of the justices on the court at this time had been appointed by James Madison. Notice what the Supreme Court told that school. "Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools, its general precepts expounded and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament?" The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that schools would teach Christianity in the Bible, the source of morality. Today we hear just the opposite. Few realize that today's rulings by the court often repudiate rulings delivered by the Founding Fathers themselves. In 1811, a court made a ruling which was subsequently cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. That court declared, "Whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government." Although this case dealt with a man who went into a profanity fit, profanity wasn't the problem. It was the intent of his profanity. For it had not been a moment of anger or a temporary loss of control, but it was a deliberate and a planned act. He had even taken the time to write it out and distribute it. In that writing, he had maliciously and capriciously attacked Jesus Christ, declaring that Jesus Christ is so-and-so, or God is so-and-so, or the Bible is such and such, continuing through a string of accusations and profanities against Jesus Christ and the Word of God. The court explained that the problem with his writings was that an attack on Jesus Christ was an attack on Christianity. An attack on Christianity was an attack on the foundation of the country. Therefore, an attack on Jesus Christ was equivalent to an attack on the country. This man was sentenced to 3 months in prison and a $500 fine for attacking the country by attacking Jesus. And notice the date of that case, 1811, nearly 2 decades after the First Amendment was in place. The First Amendment never intended to separate Christian principles from government. Yet today we so often hear the First Amendment coupled with the phrase, separation of church and state. The First Amendment simply states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Obviously, the words separation, church, or state are not found in the First Amendment. Furthermore, that phrase appears in no founding document. While most recognize the phrase separation of church and state, few know its source. But it is important to understand the origins of that phrase. What is the history of the First Amendment? The process of drafting the First Amendment made the intent of the founders abundantly clear, for before they approved the final wording, the First Amendment went through nearly a dozen different iterations and extensive discussions. Those discussions recorded in the U.S. congressional records from June the 7th,